Welcome back to this tutorial series on implementing a basic quest in Divinity Original Sin 2. If you're watching these videos in order, you might notice that our screen looks quite a bit different than the previous episode. That's because after going along in the series, I've come to realize that we probably should have addressed the issue of what the story is and how story scripting works a little bit more before we dove into some of the later parts. So I'm actually coming back to the topic of story and going to address that earlier within the series than originally planned. So don't worry about how these things got here. If you continue to watch the series, you'll find that out. But for today, what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about story. Once you have created a terrain and you put in your AI seeder and your start location, and you've built the AI grid and have a place to walk around, it's probably a good idea to just go right ahead and to build your first story, because you're going to need that in order to play it in the game client, and as soon as you start adding things later, you're going to want to have that built. So in order to do that, we're going to come up to here where it says Story Editor. We click on that icon and it will bring up the Story Editor. So what is a story in Divinity Original Sin 2 anyway? Well, let's think about any kind of role-playing game where you have a rule set, you have players, and you have a game master. The engine for Divinity Original Sin 2 is kind of what defines the rule set. This isn't a perfect analogy, there are other aspects of the game that define the rule set, but think of the engine and other external parts as the rule set. And think of the story as the game master. The game master causes things to happen, it influences the story that the players experience, it can change it, it can manipulate it. The story can do things like spawn creatures, it can give items, it can take items, it can move players from one place to another. So this is where the scripting happens that controls the flow of the game for the player. The story is written in its own language, it's called Osiris, and it's organized into what are called goals. In the left pane window, we'll see the goals for our story so far. We haven't created anything, but these are already here because whenever you create a new campaign, you begin with a template of shared goals that are already there to help you with a lot of the basic behaviors within the game. You'll also notice that they're gray, and this indicates that they can't be modified directly. If you were to ever want to modify anything here, you would have to copy it to your own module and change it. You should not do that unless you really know what you're doing. So even though we have not created anything ourselves, the story has not yet been compiled. Remember, we said that the story is written in a language called Osiris. If you were to double-click one of these, you can see an example of what Osiris looks like here. This is the syntax for the programming language. But this has to be compiled into something that the game can use. So the first thing that you want to do in order to generate your story is do a generate definitions, build, and reload. We'll get more into the specifics of what those mean, but that's all there is to it. It says build success, okay, now we have a story. Technically, if we had character creation working, we could fire this up in the game client, and you would have everything you need to just walk around in the level. Now before we talk about what definitions are, or building and reloading means, I do want to bring up maybe an example of a story that might make a little more sense. A lot of the values that begin here in the template are a little bit abstract because they're dealing with different systems. So let's bring up the origin story in order to see an example of Larian story from the main game. This is also a very good way to figure out how they do things. So if you get stuck and you're familiar with the Origins game because you've been playing it and you love it and you want to see how they did something, opening up their story and looking at their scripting is a great way to learn because you learn best practices. You may notice that Larian has added some additional checks for things you might not have thought of that could happen in the midst of your story. We won't open a level here, we will just go right to the story editor. And if we bring it up, under their start goal, you'll see some familiar names like Arcs and Fort Joy, and if we open up Fort Joy, you can see again how it's organized into a number of different logical categories. So inside each one of these goals is where the quest or the story is being controlled. Naturally, we don't want to get too much into spoiler territory here, but for instance, if we were to click on FTJ starting area and we bring this up, you can see here where a number of flags are being set in order to add the journal entry for escape from Fort Joy, and it updates the journal entry, updates the journal entry for the source caller, and so on and so forth. So we won't go too deep into this, but I think it's useful to open this up, kind of see how they have it organized, and also just to encourage you to go ahead and come in here and look at how things are done if you want some ideas as to how you can do things in your own story. So with that said, let's go back to our own story and let's talk a little bit about what Osiris is and how it operates. Now, if you're an experienced programmer, I am going to put links to the Larian Wiki that go into details about the Osiris syntax and best practices. They have some good information there to help you get going. If you aren't someone who has done a lot of software for your background, I'll try to give you a real-world analogy in terms of how to think of what's going on, and although no analogy is perfect, hopefully it will be helpful to you. Osiris uses an event-driven model, which means as the game is being played, Osiris will send out notifications of certain things being happen. And when you write goals, you write code that waits and traps or catches these events, then can make some queries for additional information, and then decide whether or not it wants to take any actions upon those events. So imagine, if you will, that the Olympic Games were taking place. Osiris might have a couple of hundred different Twitter accounts, and you could decide to follow any one of them and be notified when something that particularly interests you happens. Perhaps a goal is scored in a game. You could say you could subscribe to that feed, and anytime a goal is scored, you would get a notification, and you could decide whether or not you want to retweet that or reply. Of course, subscribing to something like when any goal is scored might be too much information, so you might start to filter that down more and more, where you'd say a goal is scored in a particular sport, or maybe a goal is scored in a particular sport by a particular gender. You could filter it down further and further until you get a very specific matrix of things that interest you, and then take action on that. Now, bringing that over into our game-specific interests, any one of your goals could do things like decide to subscribe or follow actions like an item was added to a player's inventory, or maybe a creature is killed, or perhaps a player entered a trigger, or maybe a dialogue finishes. These are the types of things that you can be waiting on and catch when they happen, and then decide what actions your story is going to take in the game. So in this tutorial, let's just build one very simple example where a player walks through a trigger and we just display some text over their head. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to come back over here into our level. I'm going to select on the triggers here, and I'm going to choose an event trigger from the list of triggers. I'm going to place a new object, and I'm going to place that somewhere in the world here. Okay, now with triggers, you have to define their bounds here. Once I click on the trigger, I can come over here to edit shape bounds. Once I hit that, you'll see we'll get a little box, and then I can drag the size of this trigger. So whenever the player walks in here, it's going to fire an event through Osiris that basically says, hey, a character entered this trigger. This is plenty big enough for what we're using. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the properties of this trigger, and what we'll do is we'll come up and we'll just give it a name that we'll recognize. We'll just say LDC Osiris test. We'll call it that, and then we'll save. Now we'll go back to our story editor, And we're going to create our own story goal. What we're going to do is we're going to put it under this start goal. I'll explain that in a minute why. We're going to call it LDC test. Why did we put it here? The answer is that Osiris basically takes all of these goals, shuffles them alphabetically, and notifies them in that order. Now that can become a little bit of a problem, because what if, for instance, we have our LDC test here, and maybe it wants to make use of something in the crime item ownership. Maybe there are some procedures in there that are helpful to us and we want to use them. We want to make sure that all of the code in there is initialized before we try to make use of them. When Osiris begins, it's going to run down the list and it's going to run the initialization section of each goal. Then, once a goal completes or exits, it will then run the initialization code of any children underneath it. So if we put LDC test underneath start, we can guarantee that if we look at start for a moment, we will see that there's a goal completed statement here after game event is set, and that basically guarantees that all of these goals here are going to initialize before our initialization gets started. There is more clear and full information about this on the wiki, but we wanted to at least give a brief explanation as to why we're putting this under here. Now with this here, we still aren't guaranteeing that this is going to execute before any of these. For our purposes here, that's not a huge deal. But again, if you go back and you look at that Origins project that we opened up, what they will do is they will usually put in a goal for a level, and then that level will be very basic. It will basically have some code that says when the region is started, complete the goal. And then everything will be a sub-goal underneath of that. I don't want to get boiled down in a lot of extra code for this tutorial, so I'm just going to put it right here. But be aware that with this test that we're doing, there is no guarantee of the ordering of anything under this start goal. But for our purposes, this will be okay. So now that we have a goal, we have a place where we can enter our code, telling Osiris to notify us anytime a character enters that trigger. Now every event that you want to catch begins with an if statement. So we're going to start with if. And at this point we need to figure out what the syntax is for detecting when a character enters a trigger. Now there's no shortcut around to the fact that you're just going to have to take some time to get familiar with what API calls are available to you. However, there are some things to help you. You know you have a trigger, you know you're interested when a character enters it. So one thing I can start to do is I could just type in the word trigger. And then if I hold down Control and hit the space bar, it will give me a drop-down menu of all the different possible API calls that are here. Now there are a lot of them. So I can see that now I have some calls here that deal with characters and triggers. And if I scroll, I find this one that says character enter trigger. So if I hit return, it will auto-complete the rest of the call. And then up here you can see that it gives you the arguments. So this call is expecting the GUID of a character and the GUID of a trigger. And I have one of two options. I can either tell Osiris the very specific character and the very specific trigger in this call when I want to be notified, or I can use variables so that I could be notified for any character entering any trigger. But that would be too broad for our interest here. So if you want to use a variable, you can just simply do something like _char. This is a variable. We're not assigning it a value. We're basically saying if any character enters the trigger, let us know and give us the character GUID in this value. So we're not telling it the character we expect to go in there, we're leaving it open-ended, and we're asking Osiris to give us the GUID of the character when they enter the trigger. However, in this field, we do actually want to specify the exact trigger that we're interested in. We don't want to be told anytime any character enters any trigger. We want to know anytime a character enters the specific trigger that we just placed in our level. This is where generating definitions comes into play that we did earlier. You remember when we first started and we wanted to build our story, we would generate definitions, build, and reload. Think of definitions as a vocabulary list that you're giving to Osiris. Definitions can be generated from procedures that you define within your goals, but definitions can also be generated from things that you put in your level. So when I place this trigger in here, there's a GUID associated with it, and in order for Osiris to know about it, you have to come over here and you have to do generate definitions. So anytime you place new objects in your level, if you want Osiris to be able to find them and get handles to them, you'll need to generate definitions. So now that we did that, we can come over here and find the GUID of our trigger by starting to type in its name, Osiris test. You remember that's the name we were giving to our trigger over here. And again, if we hit Control Spacebar, you'll see that it can find the GUID of it. And if we click that, now we have our full event catch. Now, just to help visualize again the different of what's going on right here, right? So imagine if I had if character entered trigger, and something that I just happen to know about because of the way character creation is being handled right now is there are dummy characters that are used for the toolset to be able to do character creation without real character creation. Let's say I did character enter trigger and I hit dummy, Control Spacebar. These are one of the 4 different character creation dummies that you can get assigned when you try to test things in the toolset. If I were to do this, the difference between these 2 calls is saying if this character creation dummy enters the trigger, then let me know and I'm going to take some course of action. Again, what we did here is this is a variable. This is saying if any character enters this trigger, we want to know about it and we want you to give us the GUID so that then we can take some action upon it. And we'll see that in our next line. So I'm going to get rid of this, and then after our if statement, which is catching the event, anything that happens after the then statement is taking actions. So over here, again, just having some familiarity with the API, I know that there's a call, display text. If I hit that, it wants the GUID string of an object and the text to float over that character. Now for the object, we can get that from here, right? We told Osiris to give us the GUID of the object that's going in the trigger. So if we do display text and we use that same variable here, the text should be displayed over the character that entered the trigger. And then we can just add some kind of text that we want to see here. Little syntax note, whenever you are catching events, there is no semicolon at the end of it, or doing queries. Think of the semicolon as defining actions that you take, so don't forget those. We will save, and now we will do a build and reload. The build will take this and it will try to compile it to something that the game engine can use, and it will tell you of any errors, and then it will also reload the story. So we'll see if we made any mistakes. Build success. We can close this, and we'll reload our level and story over here. Now Now, one thing we had not done after we placed our trigger was to rebuild the AI grid whenever you're placing events, and especially events that change the behavior of your terrain. You'll want to rebuild the AI, so we will do that. We'll hit AI, and because this is a small map, we'll just do a full regenerate. Later on in the series, you'll see when we do partial generates, so that you don't have to do the whole thing every time. And we'll get rid of that. And we'll reload our level and story. And if we switch to the game mode, and we click on a character and run over into the trigger, you can see that we get that floating text. So, that's how to make some basic additions to the story. Once again, this is a very basic introduction to the story. We at least want to orient people as to what its function is, what it looks like, how it operates, and most importantly, to remind people that when they create a new terrain and when they want to implement a basic quest, it's good to just come over and do a full generate definitions build and reload right from the start before you add anything, just to make sure you have a good clean starting point. And then that will ensure that if you try to play the game, you'll have your story defined, and it also makes sure that you already generated definitions once, so that when you start to try to use and make additions, your own personal additions to the story, you'll have those definitions up front. Don't forget to regenerate them whenever you add things to your level. And beyond that, we will continue to just build upon story scripting as we make this quest, instead of trying to cover everything that's possible. That would be impossible because there's just so much to learn. But again, we will continue to iterate on this with our quest. Whenever we have to do story scripting, we'll continue adding to our goals. And I will put links in the description of this video where you can find excellent documentation so far on Osiris, and they keep adding to it. If you are not a software person, it might be a lot to take in at a first reading, so just take it in some chunks. Maybe you read a little bit, get tired, come back to it again. And if you get stuck, again, you can always open the origin story, try to reverse engineer some of the things that they've done, or go to the forums, go to Discord, ask some people for some help. Don't be too intimidated by it. It's very awkward at first, but once you start to learn the logic of the language, you'll get into a rhythm, you'll start to get into a little bit of a flow, and it'll become a lot easier for you. I hope this helps, and good luck on your story goals.